As above, so below. That's the topic for today. The phrase comes from the Emerald Tablet, which is a document that it was written down in the 8th century in Arabic. It could be that the principles are far older, but the document is an example of what's known as technical hermetica, which includes the practice of alchemy. Alchemy not just as an attempt to make gold out of lead, which is actually a fairly late endeavor in terms of the whole history of alchemy, but alchemy as a wisdom path, as a way of getting to know the soul of things, the inner voice of nature. So here's Sir Isaac Newton's translation of that particular idea from the Emerald Tablet. That which is below is like that which is above, and that which is above is like that which is below. Sir Isaac Newton, alchemist, practiced alchemy for decades, as well as physics. For him, they work together. And in his writing, he talks about how he's seeking the great vegetative principle of matter, the spark or the soul that animates all of it. There's some evidence that he actually considered the mathematics of the great Principia that he was goaded into publishing somewhat less subtle than something that he was looking for in terms of explaining why matter is the way that it is and why it has life. So when we think about the cosmos and reality in general from a Hermetic standpoint, what might come to mind is William Blake's phrase, energy is eternal delight, as well as the Emerald Tablet. We're in a cosmos that is structured by patterns of power, by fantastic energies, not things. The cosmos from a Hermetic standpoint is not a machine. It's more like a vast thought or intention. There's a word that comes up in the Hermetica, energeia. It's the forerunner of the English word energy. And it means not only activity, but energeia refers to a kind of cosmic, astrological, magical force that holds things together and grows everything. As Book 10 of the Corpus Hermeticum tells us, the power of God is his will, and God's essence is to will all things to be. So that's a spiritual way of holding it. The idea has been traced to the Stoic philosophy of sympatheia, which refers to everything being held together, everything reflecting everything else, events on Earth reflected in the skies and vice versa, mostly from the top down, actually. So planetary transits, what we now think of as planets, they were thought of as stars in antiquity, and then events going on Earth, everything held together in chains of sympathy. And the Stoics link this idea to the world soul of Plato, but this actually is an idea that is probably archetypal in the sense that it occurs all over the place and way before the Stoics and way before Plato. And in fact, it occurs quite specifically in ancient Egypt, where it took the form of Heka. And Heka, you could think of in a couple of different senses. One is that Heka is cosmic communion. It's the energy, for want of a better word, that makes everything participate with everything else. That Heka is behind, as above, so below, and as within, so without, as the Gnostics would say. It's a kind of energetic cosmic communion. But the Egyptians also imagined Heka as a god. And so there are depictions of Heka in Re's solar barge as he crosses the skies every day. So the Egyptian idea about this is that Heka invests the gods with magical power. And in Egyptian religion, magic wasn't seen the way it was later as this sort of extraordinary esoteric thing that we can invoke with spells. In Egyptian religion, magic was an integral part of it. It wasn't separated from everything else. So all of those Western anthropology schemes that say that animism is a very early form of spirituality, and then it gives way to magic, and then it gives way to monotheism, are pretty much overturned by all of this, not only by ancient Egypt, but by Hermetic thought as well. The Egyptians thought that Heka also invests places and objects. And I was excited to find this out because as the person who coined the name parapsychology, which a number of us have been working on for a long time now, we are interested in how the presence of place is a living presence in the psyche, not just in a literal way, but in a symbolic way too. So we see congested freeways and then we look for congested moods, or it's no accident that we, as a species, tend to go up to high places for a higher view, those kinds of symbolic hermetic connections. So Heka invests places, objects. It sometimes seems as though objects object to the way we treat them. And I've noticed in my life that when I take more care to learn the story about the things that I consider possessions, things that I purchase or I receive as gifts, when I find out more about what are they made of, where did they come from, who was involved in the labor of them, things like that, I tend to be on a better relationship with them. And I don't lose them. I hardly ever lose things. And invariably, when I do lose something, it's because I haven't paid much attention to it. It's almost like it's calling out. So all of this ties in, as Jung was quite observant about, in terms of Jung's synchronicity theory, which he worked out with Wolfgang Pauli, the physicist, who at one time was his patient. And Carl Jung wrote about synchronicity, not as synchrony, which means things that move together, but those times when a meaningful coincidence seems to join inner and outer, or you have an insight about something that's reflected in a random seeming event in the world. And the connection between the two can't be explained with simple causality. It's not complicated enough to get at what's actually happening. So the example that Jung gives in his writings is that he was working with a patient who is very rationalistic. And she was talking about, the next phase of her career and what to do with herself. And as she was talking, something very rare happened. A beetle, which is not of a kind which is not found near Jung's residence, was tapping on the window. It flew up and Jung spotted it, and then he grabbed it and he handed it to her. And Jung made the mythological connection between the beetle that flew up and the topic of the conversation, which is, what do I do now with my life and career? And there's a mythological amplification here too, because Khepri is the scarab in Egyptian mythology, who is overseer of new beginnings, the rising sun in particular. So Jung pointed out to her that the circumstances they were in seemed to favor a totally fresh and not so rationalistic approach. And this made a huge impact on his patients. So now in parapsychological work, we often ask, is it a synchronicity or is it more like a gesture of a place where we are investigating things? Oftentimes when we go out somewhere, as one of many examples, people will just pop up out of the woodwork and say, I'll show you around here. And it may not even be evident that we're looking around. I can't tell you how many times I've been out trying to get to know a place, its history, what was built there, what grows there, who the original people are, whether they're still there and all that. And I might just be walking down the street and people will just walk up to me and say, oh, you want to see this building over here? It's the first building in town or whatever. And I have not in any way indicated that I'm investigating anything. So there are numerous examples, not just in my life, but those of us who use parapsychological inquiry as a form of investigation, of things just popping up out of the woodwork and informing us. So we've come to think of them not so much as impartial cosmic laws, but more like a gesture of the soul of the place itself, which also is a Hermetic idea. There was a god named Agathodaimon who, among other things, was a god of place. You could think of it as the presence of a place, whatever the power is that rules there. So how do you know when a synchronicity is something to be taken seriously? There's a lot of mentalizing that goes on when synchronistic things happen, and it can become a sort of intellectual game. Every time a cow moos or or an airplane goes overhead, or somebody says something, you know, aha, it means something to me, you know. And we can actually get kind of inflated with that idea. And then we're turning the whole cosmos into our blackboard of learnings, you know. But with myself, I've noticed that, and I've seen this in other people too, that when it's a legitimate synchronicity, it lights you up. It's not just an intellectual insight. You feel it in your body. So you're walking down the street, you're trying to work out some difficulty in your life. You have no idea what to do next. And then somebody says something. The Greeks call that a kleidon, an auditory oracle. And that's the answer. And your whole body goes, and you have a physical reaction, an emotional reaction. That's more like a synchronicity. So that's one way to tell. Also, there's a tendency when we're locked into our intuition to be tracking possibilities and patterns and not terribly grounded, not terribly in the body. So sometimes the idea that everything is connected with everything else itself becomes intuitively numinous. It becomes fascinating to us. It kind of grabs and possesses us. And it's important to realize that some connections are more important than others. Probably waving my hand has something to do with some cosmic process somewhere else. But the real question is, does it matter right now? Probably not. So the Hermetica actually addresses this. In the Corpus Hermeticum, book 16, there's a part that says that all is one. So that's half the argument. Things are in sympathy. But if we go to the Kore Cosmo, which is one of the older documents of Hermeticism, it adds every nature which lies underneath should be co-ordered and fulfilled by those which are above. And one way to read that is that some relationships count more than others in terms of things influencing each other. Also, there's a Hermetic idea that what they call big mind or big mystery, and what some people call God, communicates its wisdom, not only through imagination, as we talked about earlier, but through oracles, through divination. So tarot, I Ching, geomancy, and on all the other hundreds, maybe thousands of methods that are used all over the world. So the Hermetic idea is that the wisdom of the universe speaks to us through these devices, not causally, but through sympatheia, through the energy of Heka. So the understanding too about Heka from ancient Egypt is that Heka invests the power of the word as well. And this goes all the way back to creation stories where the god Ta speaks the universe into being. So the Christian idea of the word probably derives from the earlier Egyptian idea of Ta speaking the universe into being. And there was an Egyptian ritual that the priests practiced at one time where they would go outside at sunrise and at sunset, and perhaps at other times, and they would intone the 7 sacred vows while they faced in the cardinal directions. And this was their way of showing gratitude to the universe and to the sun for rising every day and for setting. So there is, in all these ideas, there is the power of the word, that the word matters, that mindful speech is a virtue that we should cultivate to the best that we can. In some sense, impossible to prove perhaps, every true word we utter lights up the entire network of being, although we may never see the results. And as Hermann Hesse put it in his book Steppenwolf, a mere nothing suffices and the lightning strikes.